everybody. Charlie and Linda are here.
Hello.
With you today, and we're talking about those unskillful patterns that we all come into relationship with and how to break free of some of those patterns that hold us back from having the most joy and happiness and pleasure and well-being and harmony in our relationship. It probably is a better metaphor rather than breaking free to call it filing down the rough edges, because the whole idea of breaking free is that it's going to be in a big burst. And what's much more likely to be the case is we keep working with it incrementally, day by day, week by week, month by month. And it's as if we've been in a cell and then we've got a chisel and we're chiseling and filing that bar until finally there's enough chiseling that's gone on so that the bar doesn't keep us incarcerated anymore. And the breaking free actually happens so that we're not in the cell. But there was a lot of time and effort put into the filing that finally allowed us to break free. So I just want to give you a beautiful quote. I went to Spirit Rock and there was a visiting teacher from Asia named Ajahn Sumedho, and there was a huge crowd of people. And in his talk, he said in a very dramatic way, "We are helpless victims of our conditioning." And then there was a long pause, and everybody's, feeling it. We don't want to think we're helpless. We don't want to feel like we're victims. And then he said, until we become conscious. This is the key to breaking free. That we are going to play out the same old patterns that have been in the generations that got handed down to us, that got modeled for us, that we bring into our new relationship from our family. And they gave us the best that they could. They got it handed down to them. But we will need to be mindful to notice what those patterns are. Some of our patterns really serve us, but some of them don't. And to tell the truth about those patterns that get in our way from having the most wonderful relationship and the best possible life that we can. And when we see the prices that we pay and we see how we're getting on our own way, then we're really on our way to doing some serious filing.
Serious fighting?
Filing.
Oh.
Filing down those bars that imprison us.
Yeah. Well, before we do the filing, we might do some serious fighting. And that would be a thing that would tell us, I think I've been here before. I think we've done this before. Have you ever had that thought, like, oh, geez, here we go again, going down the rabbit hole. So when you have that feeling, or when you hear yourself thinking that, or you hear your partner saying that, chances are you're dealing with a pattern. So I just want to say a little bit about what a pattern is. It's pretty obvious. We know what it is, but sometimes it helps to be reminded that it's like a habit. It's something that we do kind of unconsciously and repetitively, and usually we've done it a number of times so that it becomes kind of automatic.
Mm-hmm.
And patterns can exist within us. We may have the pattern of responding a certain way to certain circumstances when something happens. We may have the habit of reacting, for instance, if we tend to be impatient when we get stuck in a traffic jam or when somebody cuts us off. We may have an internal tendency to become a bit peeved, or even go into road rage. But the patterns that we're talking about here are patterns that exist between people, between ourselves and somebody else. And so it's like we're co-conspirators in reinforcing and reenacting certain responses to each other. So one of us, might say something critical, and the other one will withdraw, or one of us might say or do something that creates fear in the other person, and they might react by countering that with something that could be intimidating or threatening themselves. So there are, like Linda said, patterns that can be productive and useful and helpful. But we're going to be speaking today about, we don't need to worry about those. If we've got those going, then that's usually not a problem. We're going to be talking about some of the ones that can be problematic and how we can identify them, because the earlier we identify that we are caught in a pattern, then the quicker we can both respond to it in a way that can neutralize the momentum that gets started when we both participate in it, in co-creating it.
I'd like to give a few more examples. Those examples were good, the ones that you gave. I want to give a few more of the popular ones. Denial. Also, withholding. Denial is we're not even telling ourselves the truth. Withholding would be we know, but we don't say so. Indulging in letting things come out of our mouth, blurting things out, rather than being thoughtful about how it's going to come to the other person. Not listening well. Being manipulative and indirect rather than being direct. Going passive, saying, I don't know, I don't care, not really full participation. Raging, blaming, criticizing, ignoring. These are all popular negative patterns that people bring into a relationship, probably because they saw them modeled in their family of origin. So they're carrying in the unfinished business. They haven't learned how to do it better. And sometimes it's wounds from an adult relationship, a previous relationship that still hasn't been healed, that leaves us tender. And feeling victimized by the other person and going to blame and retaliation is a very common pattern that we see. It doesn't really matter what the pattern is, whether it's avoidant, whether it's attack, whether it's defensive, whether it's passivity. It doesn't matter. The same remedies apply with all the unskillful patterns. It's to rise up to a higher level of responsibility, to catch ourselves red-handed, to admit that there's some work that we need to do to file down our own rough edges, to work with our own belief system in our mind, because when they trigger something in us, it sure seems like they're causing the trouble. And there is a grain of truth in that. But if we're in the mindset of being a victim, it leaves us powerless to really address the issue. When we can see that there aren't victims and perpetrators, they're only co-conspirators, then we're both empowered and more responsible about identifying the pattern and exploring alternatives that will work better for us.
So generally patterns get activated when there's a stimulus, and then there's a response to the stimulus. So the stimulus could be a disappointment that my partner hasn't fulfilled a promise that she made. Or it could be a disappointment that circumstances changed, and now I'm going to be deprived of something that I was looking forward to. And so that can create an internal feeling that causes me to have a certain tendency enacted. So like, let's say that I'm triggered because I feel disrespected, or I feel hurt or injured in some way. And I'm in the habit of responding anger, let's say, hypothetically. Um, uh, so that interaction will provoke a habit in my pattern in my partner, and these habits get activated because they trigger automatic. The feeling that we have in those circumstances activates an automatic response that comes from having reinforced this tendency to behave in a certain way. Most of the time, it's designed to with the hope of becoming more in control of the situation, or of influencing a situation to change in a way that I'm not so uncomfortable, or that I'm more satisfied. And when both people are doing the same thing in their own way, both people have the same intention, which is, I want to get more control back, or I want to feel safer, or I want to fulfill this desire that this person is preventing me from fulfilling, then you can see that that's really a setup for disaster, because you're both trying to get the other person to accommodate you. And if that pattern isn't interrupted in some way by one of you taking, like Linda said, taking responsibility, then what's going to happen is you're going to keep trying to correct or change or influence the other person so that the situation will change.
So people feel like they're working hard, but what they're working hard is to make the other person change their habit, rather than they're looking at their own patterns and taking responsibility for the way they're dancing. And if they dance differently, the other person is likely to follow their lead and dance differently.
But not necessarily.
Not always.
Yeah.
But if we keep our attention on ourselves, the chances are greater that we can break free from the patterns that drag us down, that make us heavy, that make us tense, that make us feel unsafe, that rob us from the harmony.
That can be very challenging to keep, or to redirect our attention back to ourselves, rather than looking at, how do I get him to listen to me?
Or how do I get her to pay more attention to me? She ignores me.
Or how do I get them
with the kids
to agree with me, to see it my way? And also it feels safer when I am focusing on the other person, rather than taking my eye off of them and looking at myself and asking myself, well, how is it that I might be contributing to this situation? Because after all, I'm the only one that I have any influence to change. In fact, sometimes you might have noticed that the harder you try to change the other person, the more resistant they get.
It keeps you in the cell.
Yeah.
And then while you're busy confessing their sins, it keeps you in the cell. While you're busy trying to change the other person and you point out their faults, you're keeping yourself in the cell.
So it's not just that we do want to change them, but that's not the only reason why it's hard to take our attention off of them. The other reason is that when we're focused on them, we actually feel safer than we do when we take our eyes off of them and really start looking at ourselves. We feel more vulnerable because we're not looking outside of ourselves to watch out for any potential threats or danger or attacks from them. And we actually do feel safer when we're looking at them, focusing on them, rather than looking within. When we take our eyes off of them, when we take our focus off of them, then we feel more vulnerable. So these things that we're talking about in terms of breaking the habits and interrupting the pattern, they work, but it requires some risk to do it.
It requires risk, and it's work to put the repetitions in over and over and over again. And one of the things that holds people back is feeling like it shouldn't have to be this hard. The relationship shouldn't be this hard. We shouldn't have to work at it this hard. And we're here to tell you that sometimes relationships take some work. It's just like being a big success in an athletic pursuit or in your career or mastering a musical instrument or learning a new language. You need to put in the time and the effort to be skillful at it. And sometimes people relapse into the same old habituated patterns because in some ways it feels easier. Of course, it comes with a price. And when you see the price that you're paying and how you're ripping yourself off, that sometimes is just the fuel in the tank and the motivation that you need to put the work in. So watch for the belief that's part of becoming more responsible, is the beliefs that might be getting in your way, like I shouldn't have to work that hard at it, is one of the big ones that trips people up. And here's another one. I don't want to be disloyal to my family of origin. And this is the way they did it. I learned these habituated patterns from my family. And we may need to, inside our own mind, we don't need to necessarily tell them, inside our own behavior, make some changes that fit us. Because it may have fit them, but it doesn't fit us. So being disloyal to our family, don't underestimate how that belief can keep us in yet another generation of old habituated patterns that really don't work, like reactivity or passivity, not asserting ourselves enough, or being aggressive rather than assertive, not really learning how to negotiate for our needs, not learning what you were talking about a little bit ago about having the courage to be vulnerable, which is required for a real strong emotional rapport with our partner.
So there's all kinds of possibilities here in terms of how we can work with some of these automatic and sometimes unconscious habitual reactions that we have, and it does require some of the things that we've talked about. It requires willingness to take some risks, courage, creativity, willingness to be wrong, willingness to violate certain expectations that we might have gotten from observing the way other people in our family
willingness to be say I'm sorry,
mm-hmm.
to apologize to our partner for the ways we've
mm-hmm.
caused harm because we weren't conscious enough at the time.
Yeah, so all those are things that we need to be aware of, but what's also important is to be able to recognize and to affirm what there is to be gained from doing all this. After all, nobody would really be willing to put themselves in positions where they are required to do things that are unfamiliar or uncomfortable or risky, unless there was
the payoff,
something that they really saw that there was to be gained from doing this. So to have a vision of what it is that you're doing it for in the first place. Why bother making this effort, putting challenging yourself in these ways, taking this level of responsibility, when the alternative is to just stay in the pattern, which is more familiar and might even feel safer. It's got to be something compelling that grabs us and says, no, there's a lot to be gained here. And it's not just an abstract thought, but some very specific things, like to have a picture in your mind of what would it look like, what would it feel like, what would it be like if we got through this, if we were able to get free from these repetitive, boring, uncomfortable cycles that we go through. What would it be like? So take a moment and see if you can think of and feel into what it would be like if you didn't go through some of those repetitive cycles, or if you were skillful enough to recognize it when you started to go down there, but the two of you working together towards a common goal, we're able to break interrupt that trajectory and take it to another place. Imagine what that would be like if you could really count on yourselves to be able to do that, to avoid going down into that really uncomfortable place.
So I would like to risk sharing some of my very unskillful patterns that I had in the early years of my relationship with Charlie. I was conflict phobic. I would put the issues that would come up for me in the denial zone or the withhold zone, but they would leak out. And that was one of the first patterns that I had to address, because Charlie wasn't going to stay with me if he didn't feel that I could be direct and honest and open with him. So that was a pattern that I had to break, about not being so passive. Another one was to learn how to become a worthy opponent and not cave in when I brought my complaints to him, and we would interact in a very strong, passionate way. And sometimes I would just cave in, give up, lie down, have your way. And that wasn't going to do it either. I felt crummy about myself and he couldn't respect me. So that was another pattern that I had to live down. When I was coming out of hiding and not denying my anger, I came on like gangbusters, and I was so crude about the way I did it that I would shame him and blame him and scold him and call him names and call him asshole, and really was very unskillful. So I had to look at that pattern. I didn't really know how to tell the truth without blame and judgment. That was another piece of work for me. And I had to really look at how frequently I went to the victim stance and how it was a terrible thing in our relationship. And yes, many of us have truly been victimized in childhood, and we bring that sensitivity into our adult relationship. And so when things go wrong, we sometimes blame ourselves, or we sometimes think the other person is, the perpetrator and that they're causing the harm. This was one of the hardest things that I did in the early years that we were together, is to actually see myself as powerful and that I could be abusive and destructive myself. I saw myself as so weak, I didn't really see myself as other than a victim. And it took a while for me to really get who I was, and that I scared him and that I hurt him. It didn't fit my self-concept. So not to take things so personally. If he was preoccupied that somehow he didn't love me, didn't care about me, that he was a selfish SOB, that was a pattern for me to get very hurt and sometimes furious when I was neglected. So I had a lot of patterns that I had in my life before I even knew him. But when our relationship got closer and I felt safer with him, they rose up to the surface. And that was difficult, challenging, but an opportunity to see how to create patterns that would work better for us. Like just speaking the truth of our experience with each other without the blame and the judgment part, without taking things so personally and thinking I'm the center of the universe, or thinking I'm so insignificant that I didn't deserve better. So there's so many ways that we can file down our rough edges. I just shared some of mine because I want you to know that all of that work, and yes, it was a lot of work, has so many payoffs afterward. And we've been enjoying them for years. The safety, the cooperation, the co-creative process that we can teach together. We can write books together. We can write blogs together. We can do video presentations together. We can travel together. We're more cooperative in the way we parent and the way we grandparent. The level of trust and harmony is so much bigger than it was when those patterns had us. And I'm rejoicing in it.
Yeah, I just want to say before we close, I want to say a little bit about what we refer to as complementary patterns. in our case, and in most cases, we couples often draw to each individual in the partnership draws somebody in who has a complementary pattern, has complementary patterns to theirs. So Linda's was to accommodate or capitulate, and mine was to intimidate and threaten and try to control in a more aggressive way.
And it was a happy day in my life when you owned up to that pattern and got to work on it.
Yeah, well, owning up to your pattern and acknowledging it, accepting that as your part in the co-patterning process is an important step, and it's not that easy to do, because it can be, we all like to see ourselves as being innocent. Easier to feel like an innocent victim than it is to see yourself as a perpetrator. But we are in some ways all innocent, and we are in some ways all perpetrators, and we all have our strategies. And sometimes it can seem as though one person is on the receiving end of somebody else's pattern. But if you look carefully, in almost all cases, what you're going to see is that we're each acting out our own controlling defensive patterns, but in different ways, and some of them are more obvious than others. So it's always easier to see what the other person's doing wrong than what we are. But that's part of the challenge of doing the work, is to, even though you can be right about, hey, you are causing, or you are creating, or you are contributing to this problem right now between us. And often both people are making the same accusation of the other person. Of course, we each have different specifics that we're accusing them of, but it's a lot easier to do that than it is to look at ourselves. So that's kind of the bottom line.
I want to thank you. I want to thank you for all the looking at yourself you've done for decades now, and for breaking free from your crummy patterns that you brought in. I'll acknowledge myself for the work that I've done, because both of us have really worked hard to break free from our patterns. And boy, it's really so much more enjoyable to live without those crummy patterns.
Well, just in closing, I want to respond to that. Thank you, first of all, for
You're welcome.
That acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge you too, because you've done, your work too.
We've inspired each other to do it, because the payoffs have been so sweet.
Yeah. There's a saying that the older I get, the more truth I see to it, which is that your partner is your mirror and your best teacher. So if you can spot it, then you've got it.
That's right. And I'll remind you about the opening of this video, honoring Ajahn Sumedho. We're helpless victims of our conditioning until we become conscious. So do your work to become more conscious, and you'll reap the benefits. I want to tell you about next week. Next week, we are going to be delving into the topic of some tips to deal with marital boredom, about how to keep the relationship really alive and vital over the years. All right. All the best to you.